Hello, everyone. My name is Bianca Andrews, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Urban and Regional Planning and Design program here in the school. My research centers storytelling and personal testimonies to show how Black women in Berry Farms navigated displacement and fought to preserve the historic status of the neighborhood during public housing demolition. Today, we are joined by an amazing panel of speakers, starting with Dr. Taisha Redden, who is an assistant professor of Africana Studies at Gettysburg College, and she specializes in housing, social policy, and urban governance failures. Her work considers how race, class, gender, and sexuality influence the lived urban experiences of residents. Next, we have Dr. Andrea Roberts, who is an associate professor of urban and environmental planning at the University of Virginia School of Architecture. Dr. Roberts' current work uses participatory action and engaged ethnographic research to map the unrecorded histories of endangered historic Black settlements and towns in Texas called freedom colonies. Next, we have Dr. Magdalena Novoa. She is an assistant professor of urban and regional planning at the University of Illinois. Magdalena work focuses on the intersections of historic preservation and social justice, the politics of cultural heritage and memory, gender and de-industrialization, grassroots organizing, and alternative planning approaches in the Americas. Last, we have Dr. Michelle Magalong, who is a presidential postdoctoral fellow and assistant professor of historic preservation at the School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at the University of Maryland. Her work has been dedicated to telling the stories of historically marginalized groups through public humanities and historic preservation. So before we dive into a very lively discussion, I'd like to quickly go over a few housekeeping rules. First, I'd like to request that all in-person attendees keep their masks on unless they are asking a question or presenting. Next, I'd like to request that all virtual attendees please mute your microphones during presentations and raise your hand during the Q&A portion following the presentations. All right, and so with Dr. Taisha Redden, we will begin our presentations. Dr. Redden.
Hello all, and thank you for the invitation and that very flattering biography. So I am an assistant professor in Africana Studies, and as said, my research is centering on community development and social policy, and particularly the ways that the intersections and oftentimes compounding inequalities can influence the lived experiences of marginalized people. Particularly, I'm interested in Black communities. And so the kind of major arc of my research to date has been centered in Porter's community in Gainesville, Florida. It is adjacent to the University of Florida, so a very similar context to Lakeland and the University of Maryland. And my research team and I, composed of myself, Dr. Catherine Frank, Dr. Laura Diedenbach, and Dr. Kristen Larson of UF's Urban and Regional Planning Department, we were tasked with strengthening local neighborhoods. It was a part of a city and university sponsored grant and was broadly defined that way, right? And so we decided that we wanted to, of course, do something planning centered, and we wanted to ultimately help strengthen an existing historically Black community. In Gainesville, there are several, but Porter's is the one that is closest to the university. So close, in fact, that the first University of Florida football game was played in Porter's. And it has a very long history with the institution and with the larger metropolitan area. So I was very interested in storytelling. I particularly use critical race theory and its pillar of reading against the grain, its use of oral narratives. In a lot of my work, and often use it as a framework. And so I thought it was very critical, it was very integral to our project that we think about the ways that storytelling could impact someone's lived experiences, and particularly the planning decisions that were made in regard to these communities. And particularly, the research team was interested in the ways that urban planning as a profession is really immersed in storytelling, whether we admit it or not, right? We are gathering details, we are crafting narratives, we are embedding them in our policy decisions, in our maps, in our plans, right? Even in the ways that we engage with communities. And very much so, we're linking this to studies of stigmatization, the ways in which geographic locales can carry a negative story, right? And in this way, the residents of those communities bear the brunt of a story that is not of their own making. And what we found was, as soon as we decided to work with the Porters community, people in the local community, both associated with the university and not, began warning us. They asked us, are you going to go to Porters during the daytime? Are you going to notify local police that you're there? Make sure you go in groups. And when we arrived, y'all, it was a Saturday afternoon. The birds were singing. The smell of wildflowers was on the breeze. And there was a young hipster skateboarding and a young white woman jogging, which to me are indicators that it might be pretty safe around here. And what we discovered was that Porter's community was vibrant and full of daily activity. There were children playing. There were many matriarchs sitting on the porch observing it all. We even noted from some of our tour walks with residents, long-term residents, that there's even biodiversity that exists in Porters that does not exist anywhere else in the city of Gainesville. And so we were very confused at these contrasting narratives that, on one hand, according to the local media and to general public consensus, Porters was one of the most crime-ridden, most dangerous communities in Gainesville. But when we talked to Porters residents, we conducted about 2 years worth of ethnographic interviews. They told us stories of a family-oriented community, a neighborhood in which over 60% of residents had at least a bachelor's degree, a long history of being one of the most prosperous and historic Black settlements post the Civil War, and in fact, a Republican stronghold until the siting of the University of Florida, which was a then all-male, all-white institution. And we uncovered, through reviewing planning documents, through interviews with city personnel, a long history of the stigmatization finding its way in planning policy and being embedded in documentation, and resulting in very real, very tangible quality of life issues for Porters residents. And so for us, we were thinking about the ways that our project could further justice. And we were able to craft, in conjunction with the residents of Porters, a neighborhood narrative that told not only the history of Porters community, but also the residents' vision for the future of development. It is a community that is constantly under attack for development. It is located between the thriving downtown area and the University of Florida. And we really wanted to equip residents with planning skills and experience that they would be able to carry forth without our continued partnership, right? Essentially handing off the torch to the residents themselves. We found that empowerment planning furthered the aims of justice. And to date, the project has been very successful. Our neighborhood narrative was adopted unanimously by the City Commission Planning Board in 2019. And we kind of rode that wave and immediately introduced another motion, which also adopted our narrative template as available to any neighborhood in the community that would like to do so. So it's been formally adopted into the city code, and we've had members of our steering committee from Porters who've gone on to represent Porters as city planning commissioners themselves. So that is the kind of broad strokes of our project. So thanks for allowing me to be able to share that with you all.
Thank you, Dr. Redden. That was absolutely amazing. I had forgot to mention in the beginning that we wanted to limit it to 4 minutes, but you actually did perfect. So it turned out wonderful. So thank you so much for that. Next, we have Dr. Andrea Roberts. I don't think we can hear Dr. Roberts online. Everyone, I'm sorry to interrupt.
She's on.
Yeah, I can now.
Sorry.
Okay.
Start over.
Oh.
Sorry, Dr. Roberts.
No, thanks for speaking up. Let me know. So thank you so much for including me in this dialogue. I'm really finding it a privilege to be able to speak because I see that this is really a model for how universities should be confronting their past, really head on and also in a substantive way. Restorative justice is a big part of the work that I do because I see restorative justice as being about a few things. It's being about confrontation, it's about challenging power dynamics, and it's about repentance. That is, I did wrong, and not only that, I'm not going to do it anymore. And it's also about system change. And so the Texas Freedom Colonies Project, which I founded in 2014, doesn't do every single one of those things, but it tries to do some of them in service of historic African-American settlements founded between 1865 and 1930 in Texas. I like to think the project is really a model for something that should be going on around the country rather than just being unique to Texas. So what we do is we work with communities to visualize their stories in order to visualize these places. We do that in a number of different ways, in interacting directly face-to-face at community events, in which we engage in a very important part of restorative justice, which is healing for the community itself. And part of healing is not necessarily just addressing harm, but it's about actually people who are parts of communities being able to validate who they are, that they are a place, and that they're not placeless. And that occurs at workshops that we hold in which we teach people to engage in recording each other's oral history in service of telling the stories and uploading them to our public-facing organ, which is the Texas Freedom Colonies Atlas and Study. And so we listen, we visualize, and we do this in the context of events in which people are connecting with one another so that they feel less alone. When I speak to people about historic African-American settlements, they often speak about towns. And they speak about a few different notable towns, such as, Rosewood, Independence Heights, but they speak less about the settlements that I'm trying to make visual, because these are with places with very little physical documentation. They don't have, 9 times out of 10, they don't have the municipal status that an official city or incorporated place has. And so the big part of our work that has to do with storytelling is people talking about the origins of not just the place, but the anchor institutions of those places in which decision-making actually happens, in which people gather. And it's also where they talk about where these places actually are, because this is information not often in the public record. So we have names of places and maybe a little bit of the story, or we have a little bit of the story, but nothing that tells us factually that it's an African-American place, or we have 2 of those things, but we don't have like actual physical location. And sometimes there's no people and there's no buildings left, but there are stakeholders. How do we know? Annually, there are historic Black settlements that hold homecomings, not at football games, but these are occasions in which the descendants return to commemorate the founders and also to raise money. That is, raise money for land stewardship, particularly cemeteries. So what we've been able to do with the Texas Freedom Colonies Project is actually make visible these places that are often only visible once a year at these events, because that's when people gather. In other instances, these communities are smack dab in the middle of cities or on the edge of cities because they came about when populations were much smaller. Why do we do this through storytelling? Again, there's a lack of documentation, and sometimes the story is all that remains. So there's this embodied knowledge that we try to make physical and visible. How do we do that? Again, events in which we train people to engage in oral histories, that is, how do you interview one another? Events in which we have people scan and record not just the stories, but images and documentation. And of course, our online atlas, which has specifically surveys in which people input details about place, which includes location images, significant buildings, all of those types of pieces of information that are not just sentimental, but they begin to tell us where these places are and more specifically, what threats they face. So what we do is by visualizing a layer of the settlements and overlaying something such as our Texas Department of Transportation layer, we're able to see ahead of time what projects are happening now, as well as in the next 4 years, and how they intersect with freedom colonies. And in that way, we're trying to prevent the type of devastation that infrastructure projects have been, that have been used to destroy communities for years. So that's just one example of some of the work we do, and I hope to answer questions and share more as we dialogue.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts, for that amazing presentation. Next, we will hear from Dr. Magdalena Novoa.
Thank you so much for this invitation, and it's an honor to be part of this amazing panel of scholars that I really admired. So I work, as Bianca introduced, I work in the intersections of preservation, planning, and the politics of memory and heritage in Latin America. I work especially in Chile, very closely with women-led grassroots organizations in the areas of industrial heritage on one side, and on the other hand, also in memory sites linked to human rights violations in the most recent dictatorship in Chile. So the work that I do is fundamentally support them to preserve stories and places that are important for them, but that have been marginalized by preservation and planning policies and experts because they either don't comply with heritage or with the accepted heritage canon, or because they remind us of very dark periods of history that very often people prefer to forget. So the work that I do think that fits in what it can be called restorative justice, especially as it is linked to memory. So I want to contextualize a little bit about restorative justice and the built environment in Latin America in general, because that's normally associated in the region with memory sites and memorials of victims of authoritarian or violent regimes of the recent past, like the military dictatorships of the Southern Cone, the repression of the Mayan people in Guatemala, for example, or the armed conflict in Colombia, among others. And I do think it would be important to expand its meaning and application to other systems of violence and the reminders like the most recent controversies about monuments to colonizers, for example, or the examples that the other speakers are giving. So second, there would be, I think, no restorative justice linked to processes of memorialization and preservation without the lead of communities, obviously. I don't think restorative justice can even exist without community engagement. But in the case of memory sites, that is one of the areas that I work in Latin America especially, it has been the community, particularly survivors, victims' widows, mothers, and grandmothers, the ones that have organized, and for a long time with no support, to find and preserve places of crime against humanity that are crucial as judicial evidence and testimony, but also because, in the words of one survivor, these are places that emanate life, the lives of people who try to survive there, places where solidarity and care manifested in the most radical ways, and currently places that constitute places of encounter and healing and of recovering and making visible stories of those who once lived and thrived, had friends, jobs, families, and really worked towards social justice. And here I think the role of storytelling has been fundamental in the work that I've done in many different ways. I've done it with these communities, but especially using art-based and situated methods to work with these groups, especially women, to help them visibilize stories and places that are often not even in maps. So I found that storytelling has been very helpful in different ways, but one important one has been to actually bridge communication between policymakers, experts, and community members, especially because storytelling doesn't use the technical and rational knowledge that is very usual in planning, but it really calls the language and of the emotions, fostering empathy, helping to understand complex experiences, and finally inspiring action. So I think that preserving stories and places are fundamental for creating processes of healing and caring in communities and environments that have been harmed by systems of power that I think have mutated through time, but in its foundations remain really in exclusion and oblivion. So when I think in restorative justice linked to memory and preservation, that is my area of work, I think about supporting communities in the work that they very often they are already doing, creating their own unwritten rules for what I call a place-based ethic of care that is important for their individual or collective memory, for their sense of belonging, for their individual and collective healing, and in general, for their purpose in life. And I think I just want to emphasize that the role of women, I found, has been pivotal in this type of work. So yeah, I can tell a little bit more about my work in the dialogue.
Thank you, Dr. Novoa, for that amazing presentation as well. Last but certainly not least, we will hear from Dr. Michelle Magalong.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to stand up as I have slides to share for folks. Again, my name is Michelle Magalong, and I'm assistant professor here in the Historic Preservation Program. So I welcome you here at the University of Maryland as we are on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people. I literally took today's panel. I took it literally in my presentation of how do we tell stories and who's inspired me as storytellers in the work I do in historic preservation. Next slide. I take it back to when I was in college. I'm not going to date myself, but this is pre 9/11. Pre 9/11, actually 1999. I met this gentleman who we call Uncle Roy or Royal Morales. When I met him, he just said, "Call me Uncle Roy." And I was an intern in downtown Los Angeles for a Filipino nonprofit organization, learning about, I was really interested in urban planning and ethnic studies at the time. And so I met Uncle Roy, and he was this dynamic tour guide. He's like, "I'm going to take you to Little Manila. Jump in the car and let's go." And so we get in the car and we get to Little Tokyo next to City Hall in downtown LA. And we all look at him as students going, "This is Little Tokyo. You're not in Little Manila." And he started to tell the story of his father, who immigrated just a block away. He immigrated as a student at a Catholic or a Christian university, who was going there for, he was really interested in setting up a Christian church and school. And so his father first came in and set up the Filipino Christian church, which was like a block away from City Hall. And then he started to tell about how his father went to school and then went home to the Philippines, married his wife, and brought her back. And then they lived in these Victorian homes, which is now where Bunker Hill is, which is where the Disney Music Hall, that really ginormous steel building. He was like, he then took us to Disney Hall, and he was like, "This is where my parents lived." You know, we're looking at Disney Hall like, "Your parents lived here?" And he's like, "No, they bulldozed, you know, they told my parents they had to bulldoze their house to make way for the city development in downtown along with the highway." Then he took us to a third place and he was like, "This is where I went to school," which at the time was just an empty lot, which we had learned was, now there's this beautiful magnet school there. But he was like, "This is where I went to school." And he pointed to this empty lot. "This is where my house was." And then he then talked about at our fourth stop, and he's like, and this is what I consider Filipino town, where he founded numerous Filipino nonprofit organizations, social service agencies. And he was like, and this is where we landed. We landed at Filipino Christian Church. And I was moved by his story because someone who was familiar with Filipino American immigration, I was like, there were 4 waves of immigration and his family followed the 4 waves. And the way that they were displaced followed urban renewal and, urban renewal policies throughout the United States. So I thought it was really interesting of like, he's not only telling his story, but he's telling the story of place in downtown Los Angeles. Next slide. Oh, before you move to the next slide. And so I was so moved by Uncle Roy that after I took this photo, I said to him, I was like drinking the Kool-Aid. I was like, what do you want? I want to help. How can I help you, Uncle Roy? And he whispered to me, he's like, I have 2 bucket list dreams. One, make this neighborhood P-Town, which he often referred to as Filipino Town in the city of LA, because there was already Little Tokyo, Chinatown, Thai Town, and Koreatown. He's like, we need a Filipino town. And then he's like, the second wish was that he wanted to get Filipino Christian Church, his father's church. He wanted it to be, he's like, I want it recognized on the highest recognition in the United States. And so it was already a city monument that he had worked on the year prior. But those were his 2 wishes that he left with me. Next slide. And Uncle Roy, that I applied to UCLA urban planning with him in mind. He was a professor at UCLA in Asian American Studies. And he did this tour to every student that took his class. So I ended up finding out like there were hundreds of students that took that same tour who were told the same stories. And Uncle Roy was really invested in telling the story because you go into downtown LA, you don't see anything Filipino. You're just like, this is Little Tokyo, not Little Manila. And Uncle Roy actually he mapped it out before GIS existed. He mapped it out. He found master's theses of all these different organizations that existed. And he found, I don't know if you can see it, on First Street, 700, there's a square. I probably see it in the next slide, but there's a square where he marks where his father's church was. So he started to map out saying we existed, but we were always displaced by the city. So next slide. But when so I came into UCLA in 2001, 2 weeks after 9/11 actually. And it was interesting because Uncle Roy died a year prior. So I couldn't tell him that I was going to go to UCLA. But as I came into UCLA, someone by the name of Eric Garcetti, our mayor, came on, who was a junior city council member, who made the promise to Uncle Roy and said, we will work on P-Town. And Eric Garcetti then asked, can we have a community advisory? So I sat as this intern, just sitting in these rooms in charrettes, listening to people say, how do you want to envision a P-Town that Uncle Roy wanted? And so I became interested in taking urban planning classes. I started doing GIS, gathering what Uncle Roy did manually, and then I inputted on GIS. So I followed, as I mentioned, Little Manila, Bunker Hill, this is Temple Beaudry, where he went to high school, to now what is historic Filipino town. So next slide. And so, I followed the process for the city and some community members. How do you do charrettes? How do you look at archival data? Uncle Roy was someone very interested in telling his stories. So there's like oral histories that he's conducted with LA Public Library. So we're able to utilize his research, and he actually published a book on his story. So I was able to like map out, was this true about the 4 waves? And doing GIS mapping, we were able to confirm what his statements were. And that ended up being my master's thesis, which is this graphic that I was able to use on a journal article, which I often say is my favorite piece of writing because I was someone who was so young and just like saw so much possibility. Oh, and next slide. And so we were able to get Historic Filipino Town designated. I often joke it's the longest sign in the city of LA, but now it's the shortest sign in the sense of everyone refers to it as hi-fi, right? And hi-fi, short for high fidelity, you know, for the music files, the audio files. To me, it saddens me because just like Soho in New York, what does Soho stand for? Does anyone know? South of Houston, Houston, right? Like, no one, how many people, if you ask them, what is Soho? They know what Soho is, but they don't know it means south of Houston, right? So you lose the essence of what Uncle Roy wanted, which we deliberated the naming of Historic Filipino Town. We wanted the public to ask, why is this place historic and what makes this Filipino town? Next slide. And now it's the hippest place to be, which, you know, we joke saying we didn't think about gentrification back then. We just wanted to get services, you know. And then the second part of Uncle Roy's wishes was the Filipino Christian Church. While I was working on my dissertation, I was then tapped by the Office of Historic Resources, and they were doing a survey, his context study on Asian Americans. And I sat on the Filipino American context statement, and we started to prioritize, like, what are some low-hanging fruit that we can get on the National Register? And of course, my hand shot up. I was like, Uncle Roy. Like, Uncle Roy wants the Filipino Christian Church. And what was interesting was he had inspired so many students who are now in leadership that everyone was like, of course, we're gonna remember Uncle Roy. And so it was expedited, and it's now listed on the National Register, which ironically is only 2 out of 3. It was only the second. The first one was listed in 96. This was listed in 2018, right? And it was interesting that we were able to get community buy-in because of the legacy of Uncle Roy and his story. That, you know, there is this power of his story that resonates with all of us, that we could all tell about the 4 waves just in the back of our heads. I mean, to me, that's very powerful to tell that story. Next slide. And I just wanted to share that, like, of how Uncle Roy, how one person can just plant that seed and tell you what their wishes are. And when I finished my dissertation, it was something that was really powerful. When I got the National Register nomination, I told my colleagues, I was like, we hit the 2 things that Uncle Roy wanted, you know? And so I often joke telling my students, don't tell me what your wishes are, because then I'll spend, you know, 20 years trying to reach what your dreams are. So thank you.
Thank you so much. That was definitely an amazing presentation. We really appreciate learning about Uncle Roy. I think we're all going to remember him now as well. So first, I'd like to thank each of our amazing speakers for their presentations and their contributions to today's dialogue, as well as their efforts towards a better built environment for us all. Next, I'd like for us to segue into the Q&A portion of today's discussion. First, I will get us started with a few questions for the speakers, and then I will open up the floor for questions first from the respondents and then the general audience. If you would like, you may also type your question into the chat, and we will do our best to get those in as well, okay? All right, so let's jump right in. The first question I'd like to pose is, how would you all define restorative justice? Now, Dr. Roberts, you started to get into this a little bit in the beginning of your presentation. So if you'd like, would you like to get us started with the Q&A?
Sure. I would just reiterate that at the core of restorative justice is the word restoration, which I think is pretty weighty. Even with reparations, we think about repair, but restoration is to bring someone to a state of having the condition before a harm was done. And so I say the obvious there because I think we have to concede that sometimes we only get part of the way toward that. And that's good, right? But I often think we have to be careful about the terms that we throw around. Restoration's about restoration to the place before harm. It's about challenging and pointing out and changing power dynamics. It's about repentance. I will not do it again. I did it, and I will not do it again. And this is what I'm doing to make sure I don't do it again. And it's very much about recognition and, of course, as Magdalena so aptly put it, the power and the significance of memory as we understand it and respect the place.
Thank you for that. It also sounded like a popcorn just happened. So Magdalena, do you want to take over?
Yeah, sure. I think Andrea has already very well put it, what I also think about restorative justice. I would just add that I think it has different dimensions depending on the disciplines, but when we are thinking about memory and about preservation, that is my the field of work that I do. I also think that we should think about care and how these processes of healing also mean establishing and recognizing the care work of places and of memory, stewardship or gatekeeping of memory that many times grassroots organizations or communities have been doing for a very long time without any recognition. And I would add as well the central role of people in restorative justice, which may be obvious, but I do think that without that in the center and in the lead, that framework obviously wouldn't exist. And I think that it actually, at least in the cases that I work in Chile and that I've seen in other parts of Latin America, actually the framework itself emerged because of the demands and the work of organized communities, especially women, in terms of memory work and memory struggles.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I think that also you segue us very well into the second question, which I hope that Dr. Redden will be ready to take on because she talked about this a little bit in her presentation. And that question is, why and how is storytelling, power sharing, and community engagement vital processes in the preservation of stories and places?
Well, I think, storytelling goes to the heart of who we are as human beings, right? Every culture across the globe has a history and a culture of storytelling, some more than others. But it has long been, since time immemorial, a way to build bonds between human beings, right? People in the midst of storytelling are able to communicate experiences that may be foreign to the audience, right? But in such a way that the audience can find moments that resonate with them, right? We go closer through the stories that we share. I give my classes the example of, have you ever met someone and they tell you they like a movie that you like, and you're like, yeah, and you suddenly like this person? Right? Sharing that story, the experience of that story is something that brings us together. So when we're thinking about how to build a better world, when we're thinking about how to heal the social transgressions that a lot of these power dynamics have created, right? I think that storytelling is a very, very fundamental part of that. And I think it is a method that particularly we as planners are able to wield quite efficiently and quite effectively, whether we realize we're doing it in our daily practice or not. And I think that is due to the fact that as planners, we are trained to be able to communicate and articulate these narratives to a variety of stakeholders, right? Anytime I tell someone about my research or give them my suggestion on development policy, I am crafting a narrative and I'm using my story to convince them, right? With all of the nuances and the dramatic flourishes, I might add. And so I think that we are pushing forward a more equitable built environment when we acknowledge and own the power of storytelling. And it's very kind of pivotal and also very integral part of our shared experience in humanity.
I think that was a very brilliant response. Thank you for that. And I think it also segues us very well into our last question, which is I would like for Michelle to take this one because she talked about this a lot with Mr. Roy. And that question is, when and how do these methods become instruments of restorative justice in the built environment?
When I was starting to do my thesis research, my methodology, I didn't really have a research and design. I learned later as a doctoral student, but I was more just following the breadcrumbs of what Uncle Roy had. I was going into photo collections in the community, and I was looking to see if I can find any documentation. So I had to be creative in the sense of, I was going to the Filipino Christian Church, and I found in their basement booklets from galas, right? From any of the, any of the giveaways that they had, or if there was beauty pageants, I would look at the ads in the back, because usually those who were paying for the ads were usually, a supporter of the church. So, I made assumptions of just like, oh, this barber, where were they located? And then I started creating an Excel spreadsheet just to find, and then I started to cross-reference. If I saw an address that said like 100 First Street, I would cross-reference it to verify, oh, this is the same dance hall that they would go to for the beauty pageants. It was a dance hall that they were an ad sponsor for. So I was just like, there was a connection. So it's just kind of digging, and doing the digging started to verify, this was when GIS was new at the time. And I joke, when I started to learn GIS, the computer monitors were so huge, it would heat up the room. And you would press send to generate the map, and you would be, I'll be back in 6 hours. And so, but that's how we were verifying it, was we were doing Excel spreadsheets of what we were finding in photographs, in oral histories, and in these archival materials to find these places. And it was something, it wasn't like I was taking a class. I ended up finding out later on, they were like, you do humanities work. And I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just trying to figure out a system. I mean, I had my roommate, she was in the photo archives with me, like looking at all these photos. She's like, is this Filipino? Which was this criteria of like, how do you figure out something that's Filipino? Because the Philippines was occupied by Americans. And so there are things that are in English. We don't use like kanji like Japanese or Korean or Chinese. So that's harder to find us in place. So if someone found something, there was a place called LVM Cafe. I knew that was Filipino. And then my classmate was saying, how do you know that's Filipino? And I was like, LVM stands for Luzon, Mindanao, and Visayas, which are the three main islands of the Philippines. But only a Filipino would know LVM was the acronym for something that was Filipino. And I was like, but that's how we were able to find each other, is when you use nicknames in English, because we have to understand that these small businesses were naming themselves while trying to hide or be invisible. So, I was articulating a place of community of just like, how do you look at trauma of places where they want to stay hidden? Like Filipinos were attacked. There were signs in the city of LA that said no Filipinos allowed, no dogs or Filipinos allowed. So, and then during the Zoot Suit riots, Filipinos were murdered during the Zoot Suit riots, which people don't know because they mistaken Filipinos for Latinx folks. And so I thought that was interesting of like, how do you do this methodology, understanding the trauma of a people, tied to so many centuries of just like oppression and discrimination. And so to find that methodology was something that I was just kind of doing by asking other folks, like, how did you know this place existed? How do you verify? So I was being trained as a social scientist, not knowing that I was using it with a humanities lens and really looking at it with a qualitative design approach.
Thank you so much. Actually, thank each of you for your insight on these very critical questions in our respective fields. Just staying in line with time, I would now like to open the floor for our respondents to pose any questions that they have for our speakers. For our respondents, we are very excited to have Lakelander, Miss Violetta Sharp Jones. She's a genealogist, the College Park Restorative Justice Commissioner and Vice President of Lakeland Community Heritage Project. And we also have community planning studio student and planning student Redwan, and they will be asking the first questions before we go to our general audience. So I asked both of them to either unmute or present yourselves in the room, and we'll have you ask your questions first. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much. I have truly enjoyed the information gathered from the panelists. Being a genealogist, a Lakelander, and now part of the Restorative Justice Commission, I have many, many questions, but Lakeland has been involved in trying to promote the history of the community, the importance of this community for some time, and that's what has led us to today. It's been quite a journey, and we will continue to do the work. But I want to ask some of you if you can give me any idea of how long some of your projects took, or the length of time that it took maybe for you to actually see something tangible that was happening or changing about whatever you were doing, whether it was a community or a particular event. Lakeland has approached doing many different things, and it's all in the talking stage, but we have not gotten to a point where we've applied action to any of that. So are we on the right track if we start with little things that we think could be tangible evidence of making Lakeland more aware to the communities? We really want to try to better identify the community that's been there for so long, and neighboring students at the University of Maryland, literally right across the street, have no knowledge of Lakeland. So can you give me a little bit of information on how we could proceed?
Dr. Redden, do you want to hop in first?
Sure. So our project was greenlit in May of 2017, and it was supposed to be a one-year project. It is 2022, y'all. And so my team, we really immersed ourselves with the Porters community. Particularly, we were interested again in how can we equip the Porters community and residents with the skills and the knowledge base that when we one day walk away, we obviously have no idea when that will be at this point, they will be able to carry this on themselves, right? And what we found is that by approaching it from a multitude of aspects, we were actually able to see tangible change rather quickly. A part of it was really getting together with our local community redevelopment agency and getting our steering committee members on a first name basis with those personnels so that it was no longer kind of us as a liaison. And really linking together, obviously, I'm sure you've probably done at this point, right? Really key members of the community and figuring out through brainstorming sessions, the ways that they can leverage the power and influence they had in their respective spheres, right? And I would say within the first year, it was really important for us to make sure that we were not creating whole new spaces to publicize what was going on in Porters, but to elevate what Porters already had going on organically. So for instance, they have an annual book bag giveaway that has school supplies for local school children that they do every August. It's a part of their block party. So what we did was take some of the information of the history of the community and we made a children's storybook. And we made sure that every book bag had a copy of that storybook, so that every child in Porters and surrounding communities would know the history of Porters. We were also able to get some of our steering committee run, well, we didn't get them to, but they ran for public office, which was very pivotal for really coming about and having these really tangible results. So Gigi Simmons became the commissioner for Porters community, and it was her that actually introduced the motions that were adopted into the municipal code. Once it seemed for a few months that things were kind of stagnant, but once the ball got rolling, it was actually too much at sometimes all of the different results that we were seeing happening and still are, which is why we're still heavily involved. And we're also very invested in the community members at this point, right? So I think approaching it from a variety of standpoints is really good, and thinking about what traditions, events, platforms the community already has organically, and how can you just elevate them?
Thank you. That sounds good. I know a large part of, and what we were most proud of, is once we got the city of College Park to acknowledge their participation in the wrongdoing. And now we need to expand on that. We have been compiling our stories, doing the storytelling for some time, and it's a great tool, but I think we need to work harder on getting that the storytelling to other people. You know, we've put it on our database, we've put it, you know, it's part of our digital archives, but to bring people to it is what we will have to constantly work on.
And if I can just add one last thing, I think a really important step was that we realized the city of Gainesville wasn't going to offer us solutions moving forward. We were going to have to translate our work into solutions that we could hand them, that were ready to go. So there was no excuse as to why they couldn't be implemented.
Do you get a lot of support from the members of that community itself? Was that a hard sell to them? Usually, you know, like it starts with a small group, and then sometimes trying to reach that diaspora is a little harder.
We do have a lot of support. We also took the time to really negotiate neighborhood tensions, right? There were tensions between renters, there were tensions between owners, there were tensions generationally between baby boomers, Gen Xers, millennials. And so we really took the time, and it was difficult at moments, but to dig in and to bring everyone to the same page. And now we're kind of in this great era where not only do we have support of Porters, but we have support of the neighboring Black communities like Pleasant Avenue or Fifth Avenue as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That was a wonderful question and an even better response. I think we have time for maybe one more question. So we can open it up to the audience, or if anybody has like that last pressing question that they'd like to ask.
Bianca, we might go to the community planning studio student.
Gotcha.
Real quick,
Yes.
if we can.
Yes,
Okay.
Redwan.
Hi, Bianca. It's nice to see you.
Hi.
Yeah, I thought you were going to be here. Thank you so much, all the speakers, for like telling your stories about storytelling. It's very empowering. My question is more about the after effect part. I mean, like, yes, we are always looking, and we got to know about this interesting tools on storytelling. But my question was more related to like, we are also doing all of this to educate people or generations who are coming in the future or the present ones. So how do you think the popular culture is helping us to create a better platform for storytelling? Thank you.
I would like to answer that. As I think about, I've been in listening sessions with a lot of organizations across the country in thinking about what is the role of social media? Because a lot of historical societies and historic preservation groups, there are a lot of older generation folks who may be retired, and they're often telling me, I don't know how to do a TikTok video, or, you know, like the way it's interesting that social media is training a generation to tell stories really quickly. So how do you tell a story in 30 seconds? Right. And it's really, you know, to me, it's fascinating that they understand the story arc, the formula of telling that story and getting your point across. And that a lot of these organizations were like, we would totally raise money, but we have no one who knows how to manage like social media content, our website design. And I know in terms of as running an organization, it's often very difficult to like just find young talent, right? Like when I put out a call for an intern, one of my board members was like, maybe you should include not just historic preservation and history and everything related to that, but what if you reached out to a cog sci person? And so we ended up hiring a cognitive science intern. She did an amazing job. I was like, this is what I've been looking for, someone to figure out and sort and organize, right? Like, how do you get people to help you? And, it's not usually the preservationists, it's like the organizers and how they see things. And so to me, social media is really powerful. And, how do you tell that story is something that, you have to learn how to do the 5-minute pitch, which I think if there's something amazing, if you can do your pitch in 30 seconds or less, that's a craft that I don't know if we're being able to translate that back into preservation. Like, how can I do Uncle Roy's story in 30 seconds? I don't know.
So I think what I try to do is really build on this trend that was first, before any of you students were born, that emerged after the miniseries on television called Roots. And after that, the surge of African Americans interested in genealogy was through the roof. And then it kind of ebbed for a while. And then you had Henry Louis Gates and his program on PBS. So you had this huge sudden interest in genealogy again. And that has really prompted a wave of individuals interested in coming to our website and to our events to talk to us, maybe not specifically about their Freedom Colony, but do you have some information about this place where my people are from?
Mhm.
And so we're not so much fixated at Texas Freedom Colonies Project about helping one settlement stand out from the crowd, but we're doing just the opposite of saying, look how many there are, and this is why they matter and have this huge footprint. And so we've really used these events for people to be seen as individuals. Yes, like my story matters, but also for people to connect and see each other. So genealogy has been such a catalyst. Its popularity in media, its popularity in TV programming has really caused people to want to dig into their past, and people of different age groups have become, as a result, have been interested. That normally it was thought of as something associated with women who are maybe middle-aged to mature, to elderly, and now we see more and more young people who are interested in learning about their origins and their past. And so all of that popularity has really supported us being able to amplify, not just, oh, look at this one feature story about this place and it matters, which is what we're used to digesting. And now more people are like, no, my place matters too, my place matters too. I have a settlement, we have a story. So now we've recorded somewhere around 464 settlements in Texas alone. And so, so it becomes more about how do we amplify everyone, right? And not just one.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Dr. Roberts, for ending us on such that strong note and that question to think about as we go forward in the work that we do. To our speakers, on behalf of the School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, we would like to thank you for participating in our dialogue series and the work that you do beyond the classroom. We are honored to have you here, and we hope to have you back many times in the future. To our respondents, our students, our organizers, and our audience, thank you so much for your attendance, and we hope to see all of you for the remaining sessions in this series. So everyone have an amazing evening and get home safely. Or for those of you who are already home, have a great rest of the evening as well.